Hey guys, how's it going? Kermody here. Welcome to a very special tutorial by Cymatics. Today I've got 9 pro drum tips for you guys. These are going to be some really high quality tips on how you can improve the mix downs of your drums, make your own drums, or a myriad of other tools. Now obviously these tips though won't be of any use unless you have the best drum samples out there, so make sure to head on down to the description of this video where I have a free sample library for you guys so you can start to put these tips into practice. Anyways, we have a lot to cover, so let's get going. I'm going to start things off with a really cool one here, and this is adding FM synthesis to your drum. Now we're going to do this in sampler, and before I even get to sampler, I'm going to show you a really cool shortcut to get to your sampler, because I'm going to imagine that a lot of you guys use drum racks. So I'm going to throw a drum rack in here. I'm going to find a Cymatics kick drum real quick. I'm going to drag that kick into the drum cell here, and I'm going to right click the title bar to turn it from simpler into sampler. So now you know a really cool shortcut. Now what we're going to do is we're going to head on over to the pitch oscillator tab where we can turn on the FM oscillator here. Now by default it's not doing anything, and I don't want to explain all the parameters and how FM synthesis works. That's a whole tutorial onto itself, but what we're going to do is we're going to start to introduce some volume so the FM synthesis is going to start to occur. Now obviously this is over the top. This was our original sample. And that's it with FM synthesis, but what we can do is we can tighten up the envelope with a quicker decay. And then playing with the chorus and the type and the volume, you can really dial in that harmonic. So let's take this off. And you can hear that added quite a bit of a nice harmonic burst to the front of our kick drum. And obviously we can dial it back to something a little more tasteful like this. But you can hear without it, our kick drum feels almost lost, almost empty, almost like it's missing something. So it's really up to you to play with these parameters. I recommend, again, a quick decay so the envelope's nice and short, and then mess around with the volume, the chorus, and the type to get your desired harmonic quality. But that's how you can add some FM bursts to the front of your drum. Now for tip number 2 here, I'm going to recommend that you start tuning your drums to the root of your song or to a nice harmonic in your song. Now this isn't possible with a lot of cymbals and things that are really noisy and atonal, but quite often your kicks and your snares and sometimes even claps and things actually have a really obvious pitch in them. And I'm going to show you how to identify it so you can tune the drum to your song. So let's say we have our snare here. And I'm just going to isolate the really tonal part of this right here, just to make things a little easier. Now there's 2 things we can do. The first is I want to find this with spectrum. I'm going to throw spectrum on here. And what you're going to do is you're going to double click it to open up the spectral window so it's as big as possible. And you're taking a peek for this high peak in volume frequencies right here. Now this is saying that this is a D sharp. If you look in the bottom left of our spectral analyzer, it says that this Hertz value here is a D sharp. So we actually know now that this snare is a D sharp. Sometimes you can also throw tuner on as another way of finding it out. Sometimes though the drums are too short, for example here, but sometimes it can be really good for kicks, for example, or we can warp it sometimes and actually stretch it way out, and sometimes it'll actually find it. So there we go, our tuner's actually saying it's probably closer to a D here. So using both the spectral analyzer, there we go, see I was off visually. So it's nice to use the tuner to confirm that was actually closer to a D right there. So you can actually use these techniques, the tuner, the spectrum, to find out what note your drum is playing so that when you drag a drum in the beginning of the writing process, you can actually keep it to the key of your song. It's going to really glue your mix together. It's going to glue the song and really make it feel more cohesive. So the next technique I'm going to show you is called topping and tailing, and this is a way you can kind of customize your drums using the beginning, the middle, and the end, the front and the tail and a middle of multiple drums, and combine them to feel like a new one. Now I'm going to demonstrate this with probably a clap, and actually I'm going to get unique and I'm going to use some Foley here to show you. So let's find a nice clap here. I like that one. I don't really like the tail. I don't really like the body, or I don't want the tail or the body. So what we're going to do is we're going to just grab the transient of this, and we're actually going to fade it nice and tight. Perfect. That's all I want. Now we're going to do the same thing, except with the body of a clap. Listening only for the body. I like that one there. Except this time we're going to fade it out. That's sounding cool. And now to finish things off for the tail, I'm going to get creative because you don't just have to use all the same samples. I'm going to use some Foley. So let's find some appropriate Foley that we're going to use for just the tail. I like that camera shutter sound here. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring it in, and this one we're going to fade out of the way of the front, and we're going to fade it out of the way of the tail. And that is a pretty cool custom drum right there. So that's going to lead us nicely into our next tip. So continuing on that with that tip, this next tip is layering. And so let's say, for example, we're going to turn this into just one drum here. So we're actually going to resample this down real quick. And now that we have it on just one track, we're going to layer this further and make it even denser and more rich. And so the first technique, continuing what we were doing, is just layering with some Foley. I just used a camera shutter and I used it for the tail, but I want to start to use some whole pieces to really beef this up. So this is up to you to get creative. Let's listen for maybe some wood sounds. I like the front of that. That could be really cool. Might even pitch it up. Again, it's up to you. Just have fun. Don't think too much about it. I find for this type of sound design, it's nice to kind of just move quickly and see what sort of results you can get. That's cool. It's kind of pushing it into more of the future bass realm of clap. And then lastly, maybe I'll layer it with some water of some sort. I like that. That's going to be really nice. And there you have it. So I hope that's just getting you thinking about layering, and I've got another one for you here before we move on to the next tip. I'm going to pull up a snare real quick, and I want to show you a really cool way to layer to add some three-dimensional aspects to this. So we've got a pretty mono snare here, and what we're going to do is we're going to layer stereo offset claps. So what we're going to do is we're going to find two claps that sound kind of similar but not quite. So let's do that real quick. So I find these two are kind of similar here, but they're obviously quite different. So what's really fun now is if we pan them a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right, not too drastic, so maybe we'll stick in kind of the 25 range here, and we tuck them into the mix. This is a really cool way to add stereo information into a snare. Now I'll take it off real quick, and I'll add it back in. And you can hear that's kind of added a dimension, but it's still really blended in, and it's not something that the listener will notice. It's something they'll more feel. Now to really demonstrate what's going on here, I've grouped them, and I'm going to apply a utility to the group, and I'm going to set it to 200% width. Now that's not making it wider. What it's doing is you're only hearing the stereo information when it's set to 200, and you can hear what's been introduced into the sample. While without the claps, the stereo field is completely empty. There's nothing there. So having these differences, these interaural differences in each ear gives the perception of width and is a really cool way to add dimension to a drum. So take that Foley layering idea, take this clap layering idea, and really get creative. Don't just do this. I just want to get you thinking about layering. I think it's a really powerful technique. So for the next tip, I'm going to tell you guys about tonal layering. Now this can apply in a lot of situations. We're going to first start with a snare, and then I'm going to show you a kick, and then it's up to you to explore the idea. So what we want to do is we want to take a snare that doesn't really have a tone to it and actually introduce tone. So I'm going to find one like that in a Cymatics pack here. So I decided on this one here. It does have a tone to it, but it's a lot more subtle than some of the other snares in the pack. And what we're going to do is we're going to introduce tone to it. So I'm going to turn this down just to compensate because we are going to be adding new signal in. And what's really fun about this is I'm actually going to look for a tom drum that I think will suit this. So let's go through the tom packs here. And we're listening for a really tonal tom. Perfect. Now what we're going to do is we're going to drag it in and we're going to bring it underneath. We're also going to turn it down to compensate. And we also want to make it a bit shorter. We want to tighten this thing up. I'm going to do that just manually with fades. And now it's up to you to tune the tom to the pitch of your song. Obviously, there's going to be another step, but let's just find a pitch that sounds pleasant. Believe it or not, I actually liked the root that it was at already. It's perfect for this. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to group these together and we're going to exaggerate that tone even more, and we're going to put distortion after it. And the reason for this is by boosting that tone in the tom and the original snare and blending them into distortion will create even more harmonics where that tonal center is, and then we can EQ after to take out some of those harmonics. So boosting it into a distortion will not only boost the original root note, but it will then distort it, adding harmonics, and then you can turn it down and it'll really blend the layers and make them feel more cohesive. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw the EQ on here, and we're going to find that bottom where the tom is. And again, it's usually pretty obvious and pretty dominant in the visualizer. That really brought it out. I really like that. Now we're going to saturate it afterwards. I'm not going to teach you guys about saturator now. That's a whole other tutorial. So I'm just going to use a preset. Now it's driving it a little bit hard. Let's dial it back. You can hear that's really starting to bring that out now. And I'm actually going to leave it there. I could actually, if I wanted to, EQ it out afterwards, maybe compress these together, blend them a little more, but I actually find that quite cohesive. I'm just gonna probably tighten up the tail of this snare here to make it feel like almost like a tight glitch hop snare. And you'll hear artists like Cohen Sound kind of really develop this style of snare, this kind of glitch hoppy, tonal, neuro hop, neuro funky snare. So layering toms is a really cool way to add tone into snares. Next, I'm going to show you guys how you can layer some tone into a kick drum. So let's say, for example, you just can't figure out the root note of a kick. Well, the nice thing is you can actually make your own. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through this grime kick pack here, and I'm going to listen for one that I just like the top end of. I'm not even worrying about the bottom end, so I'm just listening for a top. I'll just use the first one here. So what we're going to do is we're going to EQ out the sub frequencies. So I'm going to go probably somewhere around 100 Hertz. I don't want anything below that. I might even do a little higher, but maybe less steep curve. Perfect. That's all I want from this sound here. I'm going to turn it down to compensate because we're going to add a new layer. And next what we're going to do is we're going to create a MIDI track below it. Now this is great for starting a track when you know the key it's going to be in, and then you can actually just bounce this after so you have this as a drum in key. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to find Serum because I know a lot of you have Serum. And I'm going to put input the note that my song is in. So let's say F. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to drop this quite far down. So probably there. Now it's going to sound terrible as a saw, so what we want to do is we want to go to our analog basic shapes and we want to find a sine wave to start. Obviously you guys can test out different wavetables on your own. Next, what I want to do is I want to tighten up the envelope to be sort of the volume shape of the kick. And we could do further shaping after. But what really makes this thing proper is giving it some punch in the low end. Now, right now it sounds really stale and not what the bottom of a kick drum sounds like naturally at all. But if you throw a real kick drum inside of a spectral analyzer, you'll see the bottom end almost look like it goes from a high frequency to a low frequency, and that's what creates that punch, is that quick drop in pitch. So I'm actually going to recreate that now. So I'm going to use the second envelope in Serum here, and I'm going to head on over to the matrix, and I'm going to send the second envelope to the global master tuning, and then I'm going to pick the pitch distance that it's going to travel. You can hear instantly that made that nice and punchy. Now it's up to you to try out a different wavetable. Maybe there's one with nicer harmonics, maybe add some distortion, but in its most basic form, this would be how you create the bottom to your kick. So I'm going to freeze it and flatten it. So we have it in audio now. And now we can actually further shape it with fades. So it's kind of the same shape as the original kick drum. And then similar to the previous process with the snare, we're going to group them together and we'll probably maybe EQ them so they take on a similar character, add some saturation so they start to blend. But now we can export this to our library as a kick that we know the root note of. So this is a really cool way to know the pitch of a drum and export it and have it in your library so you can use it in the right context. Now I want to show you how you can add additional pitch envelopes to your drums. So this is very similar starting process to the first tip. We're going to pull in sampler here, and I'm going to find a drum that's kind of soft on the front end. I'm going to go with this one here. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to head on over to the pitch oscillator tab, and we're going to turn on the pitch envelope. Now I just explained in the last tip that kick drum is punchy because the low end of it, or the whole thing, is kind of just dropping in pitch really quickly. Well, we can add an additional amount of that to a drum. So now that the pitch envelope's on, what we're going to do is we're going to set the amount. This is how far in pitch it's traveling. Again, just like what we just did in Serum. And then I'm just going to tighten up the decay. Now you can see I didn't think about it at all. You can obviously edit it a little further, but just for the example, let me turn this off now. Let me turn this on. And you can hear this has a nice click to the front of it. Now it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but there's a clear difference on how this is not going to cut through the mix in the front end compared to that. So experiment with this. Again, don't just do it to kicks too. Try it on a bunch of different sounds. Try it on snares or whatever. Really useful. So for this next tutorial, I'm going to teach you guys how you can separate both the transient and the body of a drum. I think this is incredibly important because often when processing drums with compression, distortion, EQ, stereo effects, whatever it is, you're actually damaging the transient, the initial thwack that really helps it cut and be clear. Now, this technique is a really cool way that you can separate them so you can process them differently. Maybe you can have different transient shapers on the transient or different EQ on just the transient. Maybe you can turn down the tail. It's really useful. So let's go. We've got our snare here, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to throw on a gate. Now, for those of you that don't know, a gate works similarly to a compressor, but sort of the opposite. For compressors, when something goes over the threshold, it gets turned down. With gates, when something goes under the threshold, it gets turned down. So it gets turned down by the floor value. So the first thing we want to do is turn it down an infinite amount. We want it to turn down to minus infinite. Next, we're going to move the threshold to try and isolate the transient. That's about as good as we're going to get. We're going to tighten the attack so we get as much click as possible, and we're going to shorten the release and hold a little bit. There we go. We've got the transient. Now what we're going to do though, and this is where the magic comes in, is we're going to group this, and we're going to call this one the transient. And we're going to duplicate this, and we're going to call this one the body. Now, don't hit play because this might hurt your ears, but this is where the magic comes in. When you hit flip, it does the opposite now. Instead of when it goes under the threshold, it gets turned down. It's actually doing the opposite. You're only going to hear what's under the threshold. So if I solo it, that's the body, that's the transient, without the rack, with it, without, with it, it sounds identical. You haven't changed it. But now you have the two pieces separated. So now we could maybe saturate just the body. Maybe we could EQ just the body. This is a really quick example, and I'm not hearing, by the way, so I don't know if it'll be any good. And then lastly, we'll turn up the transient. So this is a really cool way you can process them separately to preserve that transient. Next up, I want to tell you to watch those reverb tails. Reverb is an absolute culprit for ruining mixes. It washes it out and can make things really messy. So what we're going to do is I'm going to slap a reverb on just for the example. And you can hear that bleeds on for far too long. So the first part of cleaning up your reverb tails is make sure that it's fully dropped to zero. It's fully decayed in volume by the time the next drum occurs. So let's say we're using snares. It's fully dropped to zero, or it's gotten really close. That's not good enough though. The problem with this is, first of all, when you're changing the dry wet, you're turning down the real one to turn up the wet one. So you're turning down the dry to turn up the wet. And again, and they're going to be playing at the same time. So the washed out nasty reverb is going to play at the same time as you want this pure clean snare. So we're actually going to push the reverb out of the way with the dry signal with a rack. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the wet value to 100%. And we're going to group this thing, and we're going to call this the reverb. And then we're going to create another chain, and we're going to call this one the dry. Now they're going to be playing at exactly the same time, same problem as before. But what's really cool is you can also just dial in the reverb on its own without affecting the dry signal. Already, I like that more than dry wet. But what's really cool is we're going to side chain the reverb away from the dry snare. So we're going to select the input from track 4, and then in the drop down menu, the dry signal. And we're going to use just some quick settings. That is much cleaner than without it. It's kind of messy. Now the initial signal punches through that little bit more. So you can actually sidechain reverb and delay and other time-based effects out of the way using the dry signal. So that's a really cool one. Now for the last technique here, I'm just going to talk to you guys a bit, and that's a concept I like to call the one transient to rule them all. In a track, often you'll have a bunch of elements hitting at once: kick, crash, bass, hat, low mid percussion, lead. And in theory, you might think that that's going to have a lot of impact, that's going to have a lot of energy. The problem with that though is the listener can't hold on or really focus on any one of those things because all of them are happening at once. So what I recommend doing, and it's actually an extension of what I just showed you, is going in and picking one transient you want to pop through really quickly and fading everything out of the way. Yeah, you can use sidechain, and it's conceptually a lot like sidechain compression, but manually fading is a lot more specific. And if you go in, and it doesn't have to be big fades like this, it could be really subtle little ones like this, just kind of pushing it out of the way so that initial thwack of the kick comes through. And if you do that with a hat and a crash and a lead, that kick can just snap through, and the listener hears a transient, kind of grabs onto it more, becomes clear and more polished and more professional. And again, that's kind of the concept behind all these, is that if you tune your drums and you phase align them and you fade them and you layer them with some stereo information, you take all these tips and you apply them in the right moments, things are just going to be that little bit better, that little bit more polished. And wouldn't we all want to have our tracks that 5% better, that 5% more professional. So there we go, guys. Those were 9 pro drum tips for you. I hope you got a lot out of this tutorial. I know there were a lot of gold nuggets and there's a lot to soak in. So don't forget to go to the description of this video and actually grab our free ultimate sample library so you can put these pro tips into practice. While you're down there, make sure to subscribe to our video and hit the notification bell so you actually get to see our tutorials, because we've got a lot of good content coming. Thanks again, guys. I'm Cymatics, we're Cymatics, and I'll be back soon with another tutorial.